Have you ever just sat at your desk, stared blankly at your screen, and felt like, well, nothing more than a disposable cog in some giant machine? Trust me, you are definitely not alone. But what if I told you that the absolute best way to understand that incredibly modern feeling of workplace apathy actually comes from a 19th century philosopher? Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're going to look at Karl Marx, not just as the historical revolutionary you read about in school, but as a sociologist, a true diagnostician of the modern workplace. We're going to use his theories to pop the hood and examine the underlying structures of exactly how we work today. I mean, we all know the feeling of the daily grind, right? That universal sense of burnout is practically everywhere. But why? Why exactly does logging out of your computer at the end of the day or clocking out of a long shift leave you feeling so utterly drained? To answer this, we're going to pivot to Marx's 19th century framework. Now, he was obviously observing the harsh realities of the Industrial Revolution and early factory work, but his diagnosis perfectly explains why the modern office cubicle or, the retail floor feels the exact way it does right now. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, the modern work dilemma. Second, defining Marxist alienation. Third, the four dimensions. And finally, reclaiming human potential. Section 1. The modern work dilemma. Setting the baseline for human nature. So, before diving into what's actually wrong with modern work, we really have to establish what human potential is supposed to look like in the first place. You can't diagnose an illness without knowing what a healthy body looks like, right? To describe this healthy baseline for human nature, Marx used a specific term, species being. This refers to the potentials and powers that are uniquely, fundamentally human. Marx pointed out that, sure, a spider conducts operations that look a lot like a weaver, and a bee building its hive could put many human architects to shame. But what distinguishes the absolute worst human architect from the very best bee is that the human raises the structure in their imagination before ever erecting it in reality. For Marx, our labor is naturally meant to take our internal imagination, our core purpose, and turn it into external reality. To really grasp this concept, think about an artist compared to a standard wage worker. When an artist paints a canvas, their labor objectifies a deeply personal vision into reality. And this is key. The actual process of creating that art transforms the creator. It's fulfilling. That is what Marx calls unalienated labor. Now, compare that to the wage worker in a typical capitalist structure. For the wage worker, labor isn't some beautiful expression of personal vision. It's merely a coerced means to an end. It's basically just something you're forced to do simply to earn the money you need to survive. Moving right along to Section 2, defining Marxist alienation, the breakdown of connection. Now that we understand Marx's ideal for human potential, that natural, creative, productive process, we have to look at his diagnosis of what happens when that process is disrupted or perverted. Marx defined alienation as the breakdown of the natural interconnection among people and what they produce. And he observed this not just as, a bad mood or a case of the Mondays at the office, but as a deep structural symptom of capitalism. It's a system where a massive amount of people produce commodities, but a very, very small group actually owns the production process, the tools, and ultimately the final products. All right, Section 3, the four dimensions. Symptoms of the capitalist structure. Alienation is a massive kind of philosophical concept, so Marx smartly broke it down into four distinct symptoms. Now, what's really interesting here is how these four steps from the 19th century map so perfectly onto our daily workplace frustrations today. According to Marx, we are alienated from our productive activity, from the product itself, from our coworkers, and finally, from our own human potential. Let's walk through each one of these dimensions to see exactly how they play out in the real world. Okay, the first dimension is alienation from productive activity. Remember that in Marx's ideal scenario, work is supposed to be an expression of your unique purpose. But under a capitalist structure, workers just don't produce objects according to their own ideas. Instead, you work for an employer who pays you a wage and basically uses your time however they see fit. Historically, this was a massive shock to the system. Early artisans who were used to owning their own tools and setting their own pace suddenly found themselves shoved into factories, completely losing control over the rhythm of their daily lives. Today, just think of an assembly line worker who turns a single bolt all day long, or a data entry clerk just typing endless numbers into a spreadsheet. You have zero connection to the total process. Work goes from being this satisfying creative act to a boring, stultifying requirement just for survival. And that builds directly into the second dimension, alienation from the product. The things that workers actually make do not belong to them. They belong to the owners who then sell them for profit. If a worker wants the very thing they spent all day making, well, they have to go to a store and buy it back. Marx highlighted a really fascinating irony here. Because of this total disconnect, the gadgets and the clothes we buy often feel way more like an expression of who we are than the actual work we produce with our own hands and minds. Crazy, right? Then we have the third dimension. Alienation from fellow workers. Marx assumed that people naturally want to work cooperatively to survive. We're a social species. But the capitalist structure totally disrupts this. Just listen to this striking quote from a worker describing the modern assembly line. You can work next to a guy for months without even knowing his name. They got these little guys coming around in white shirts, and if they see you running your mouth, they say, "This guy needs more work. Man, he's got no time to talk." That really hits the nail on the head. Natural cooperation is replaced by complete isolation. Workers are pitted against each other to see who can produce more or who can please the boss the most, essentially turning potential friends into outright competitors. And that brings us to the fourth and final dimension, alienation from human potential. Instead of the workplace being a source of fulfillment and growth, it literally becomes the place where we feel the absolute least human. We're reduced to functioning like programmed machines. Think about it. We read from corporate scripts, we force these programmed plastic smiles, and we follow incredibly rigid office routines that completely strip away our essential human qualities. Marx actually argued that under these conditions, we only really feel like freely active humans when we are doing basic animal functions, like eating, drinking, or sleeping. Which leads us to our final part, Section 4, Reclaiming Human Potential, the ultimate purpose of work. Let's zoom out a bit and look at what Marx's 19th century diagnostic tool tells us about the modern economy as a whole. Marx neutrally viewed the overarching capitalist system as the engine that basically causes these four symptoms of alienation to escalate. He observed that the economy is not some natural force like the weather. It's a political system built entirely on human choices. Furthermore, while workers might appear to freely enter into contracts to sell their labor, the reality is they actually have no choice if they want to survive. Finally, he noted that profit, what he termed surplus value, comes directly from exploiting the labor time of workers. The whole system grows by extracting that extra value from your time. And this brilliantly illustrates a point summarized by a quote directly from Karl Marx himself. He is at home when he is not working, and when he is working, he is not at home. It is honestly remarkable how deeply a quote from the mid-1800s parallels our modern struggle for work-life balance today. When we are on the clock, our time, our actions, and our output are simply not our own. So as we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with a powerful, provocative question to think about the next time you sit down at your desk or clock into a shift. If Marx's framework is accurate, if our labor is naturally meant to be the ultimate expression of our essential humanity and creativity, then under the current structure of the daily 9 to 5, who are we actually working for?